I want to introduce Craig Smith, who's an Agile coach at Suncorp, quite experienced in lots of great Agile practices, talk to you guys about Kaizen. So take it away.
Thanks everybody, how you all doing? So first thing I want to ask you is, does everybody know what time it is? Well, it's tool time. But it's actually Agile time, I guess. But the main thing I actually wanted to say about Tim Allen being up there on there is that he actually had a saying where all about more power. That's really what I want to talk to you about today, is getting more power out of your tools, more power out of your process. But if you know anything about Tim Allen, he went on to be this guy on the right here. In fact, he's just about to star in another movie again, Toy Story 3. And Buzz Lightyear had a saying, to infinity and beyond, and that's really what Kaizen's all about. So today we're going to be talking about Tim the Toolman and his more power and his infinity and beyond. So as I said, my name's Craig Smith. I'm an Agile coach for a company called Suncorp. We're located in Brisbane, Australia. That's the place on the left of screen there. For anyone who doesn't know it, because usually if you talk to Atlassian, they only really talk about Sydney and San Francisco. It's about 600 miles or 1,000 kilometres north of Sydney. And you can see that there. Our bridge isn't quite as impressive as the Golden Gate here in San Francisco, but quite nice nonetheless. On the right here is our main building, and that's where our JIRA server is installed. Our JIRA instance, we're on 4.2, we're on the latest version of GreenHopper as well. Well, actually not the latest, because 5 was released yesterday. And we have about 160 active projects at any one time. We clean them out quite regularly. And we have about 35,000 issues at any one time in our instance as well. So obviously not the biggest installation, but nonetheless. Suncorp is Australia's second largest insurer and fifth largest bank. So we're in the financial services industry. Now I'd like to take you just on a little trip into the Wayback Machine, just to tell you a little bit about Agile. Who here in the audience is doing Agile right now? Okay, fair swag. Just a little bit of history. It all started with the waterfall. In fact, we go back to 1970 and a guy called Winston Royce, and he came out with a paper about waterfall. The interesting thing about that paper is that when the US military read it, they only read the first 2 pages and thought they were doing waterfall. What they didn't realise was on page 3, Mr. Royce said that the whole thing was a bit of a fallacy and wasn't really going to work as he intended. So for 30 years odd, we were actually doing something that was never really the way the author intended. So what actually happened was a bunch of smart people got together in 2001 and got together on a summit, quite like where we are today. And they came up with something called the Agile Manifesto. So in 2001, 17 guys in Utah on a mountain decided that they wanted to do software development in a much more efficient way. And for those who haven't seen the Agile Manifesto, or maybe for those who read it when they started on their Agile journey a number of years ago, it's a really good balancing point just to get yourself grounded, to remember what Agile is all about. What I really want to do is actually refer you to the first 2 points there. What the Agile Manifesto says is, whilst we value everything here, we value the things on the left more. So whilst we value processes and tools, we really value individuals and interactions. And that may sound like a weird thing when I'm standing here at a tools conference, essentially, talking about the fact that we value individuals and interactions more than the tools that the vendors here are trying to make us use. We also value working software over comprehensive documentation. So again, you go to all these talks about Confluence and you realise that actually it's all about working software. But at the heart, as we all know, JIRA and the whole Atlassian suite are all about getting software working. And of course, customer collaboration over contract negotiation and responding to change over following a plan. These are the key things that stand behind Agile. Now, Agile in itself is an umbrella term. You may have heard of things like Scrum or XP. This is just a name that we use to put around things. So this is XP, well, Windows XP, but this is actually XP as it is in an Agile sense. The nice thing about this, about XP, is that it's really about all the technical stuff, right? So it's about refactoring, it's about pair programming, it's about test-driven development. But what you don't see in this diagram anywhere is anything that actually talks about the things that we know and love about Agile, things about iterations, right? The thing about XP is it's actually really become the mainstream without us really even trying. So things like test-driven development, continuous integration using tools like Bamboo, they are the mainstream now. So XP's just kind of evolved from being, something that was a bit out there 10 years ago to really, for the most part, being just what we do every day, especially good software development shops. Now, there's also a thing called Scrum. And, of course, if you're outside the US, you obviously think of a football scrum. If you're inside the US, like we are here, you've probably got that quizzed look on your face. In the IT world, we've all got our fingers and thumbs up because we know what Scrum's all about. This is really what we're talking about, though, and this is the thing that most people probably recognise more when we use the word Agile, which is really talking about things like prioritised backlogs, iterations and sprints, having things like product owners, iteration managers, those kind of things. It's really about how we develop the software. The thing about Agile that I kind of just wanted to reiterate is that when people think about it, they think about the thing here near the top, the practices. So they're all the terms you've probably heard about or probably use already, stand-ups, retrospectives, those kind of things. But what I want to do is just remind you that at the core of it, Agile is really about the things at the bottom of the pyramid. It's about the values and the principles. They then let you get to the practices at the top, and then that gives you an approach to the way that you do Agile software development. If you don't have these things at the bottom, you'll end up with a pyramid that's essentially going to implode on itself. It's going to fall down. And this is where lots of people on their Agile journey seem to fall over. Right? You ask people when they're doing Agile development, what are they doing? And they say, yeah, I do stand-ups and retrospectives. But it's actually so much more than that if you really want to be successful. So the first thing is that you have to have the values. You have to have things like trust, accountability, courage and honesty. Right? If you don't have the courage to get up inside your team and say, hey, I don't think we're doing the right thing here, then you're really going to fail at your Agile rollout. Similarly, if you don't have trust with your teammates, if you don't have accountability so that you're looking out for your teammates and they're looking out for you, you're going to have a bit of a tough time of it. And that is at the bottom of the pyramid. And this is really all about, for successful organisations, getting your culture right. The people that try and fail at Scrum and fail at Agile essentially have trouble with their culture. It's a really important thing to getting it right. If you've got that already switched on, then you can start to think about the principles. And there are things about making sure that you're delivering value in your software, right? That you're delivering the most business value early, that you're mitigating your risk early, that you're also dealing with things like teamwork. You've got a collaborative team working together. You're looking at the speed of delivery, right? That you're doing things as efficiently as possible. You're looking at simplicity, right? That you really want to do things, the simplest way possible. And also flexibility, right? Embracing change. Once you've got those, then of course you can move on to the practices, things like your stand-ups, your retrospectives, all the things that you know about. And finally, the last thing is your Agile Approach. And we saw some slides from Atlassian on that with the circle that you might have seen in a couple of the presentations over the last couple of days. We at Suncorp have one very similar called Concept, Initiate, Deliver and Deploy. Pretty similar type stuff. Essentially, you need to start with an idea, you need to formulate that idea, make sure that you've got your resourcing, your funding, your plan ready to go. The majority of your work should be in your delivery phase. That's when you're actually cutting code. That should be 80% of your project time. Amazing how many people don't spend that amount of time on project delivery. And finally, a little bit of wrap-up. You actually got to get the thing out to production. So that's all cool, right? Agile is cool. It's the mainstream. These are happy days. But unfortunately, I'm not the Fonz. So let's have a bit of a chat about tools. What I like to do is, and we've heard this term a little bit over the last couple of days about information radiators, right? So you've actually seen that they've released in alpha the new scoreboard type of functionality in JIRA. Really, you need to think about your tools in this kind of case. So an information radiator is like this weird-looking thing on the right-hand side. For those that don't come from the Commonwealth, this is a game called cricket. You've probably got the same type of thing here in the US with baseball. But the idea behind this is that wherever you sit on the ground, you can actually figure out what the score is, right? You can look over there and probably without even knowing too much, that some guy's got 10 runs, that the team's on 110, you can see who's bowling, you can get all that information very clearly. And that's a very manual scoreboard. We've been doing it for years. But if you think about your tools in their current form, if you think about things like Confluence and JIRA especially, they're what I call a refrigerator. In order to get that information, you actually have to go in, you probably have to log in through somewhere, you have to open the door to actually see what's in. And the problem is when you've got a team, if people have to go to a lot of effort to get to that information, they won't do it, right? So you've got to make that easier. So you've got to turn your information refrigerators into radiators. So traditionally, when we talk about Agile and Scrum, we talk about card walls. And they still are the most simple way of showing things on the wall. But sometimes you just want to go to that next level. You need to show a little bit more information. And that's where tools like GreenHopper and other sort of information radios really come to their own. But you've got to get that information out and visible to people. Otherwise, it's just locked behind the refrigerator door, and you have to open it every time to see what's in there. So we've talked a bit about Agile, and that's okay if you're doing software projects. But what if you're doing something a little bit different? You've got a dirty job, something you need to do perhaps in maintenance, support, or maybe you're just on the cutting edge and you just want to do something different. So that's where Kanban comes in. Has anyone heard or know about or doing Kanban at the moment? Okay, you've got a few out there. For those that don't, or for those that are and just want a bit of a refresher, let me just use the example here as a cup of coffee. Right? If you were to walk into Starbucks right now, right, and order a cup of coffee, what will happen is you'd pay the money to the person behind the counter, and they'd write your order up on this coffee cup here, and they'd actually then pass that on to the barista who'd make you a cup of coffee. Essentially, this coffee cup is a Kanban card. It's telling the barista exactly what they need to do, and it's a pull system, right? Because the cup essentially gets pulled across when the barista has time to make the cup of coffee. Now, what you'll see is if you go to Starbucks or any other coffee shop very early in the morning, right, it's typically very busy, right? So you'll find that the attendant behind the counter usually stems the flow, right? They'll only put your order through when they can actually process the coffee for you, and sometimes they'll have multiple machines or multiple baristas that help make that cup of coffee. So if you think about Kanban in its simplest form in this particular way, the instructions are on the cup, and the cup is the thing that's moving through the process. At the end of the Kanban process, delivery is when you get your nice steaming hot cup of coffee and you're actually not feeling as grumpy as you were when you walked in. To use another example, right, for those of us who don't go to the coffee shop but actually drink coffee at the office, there's nothing more annoying than when you go to the kitchen and there's no coffee left, right, or no tea bags or whatever it is that you drink. This here is an example of an office Kanban system. So essentially what these guys have got is they've got 2 boxes of coffee. One box is on the counter, which is the one that you go to every day when you're making a cup of coffee, and they've got a box in the cupboard. The box in the cupboard has this little card in there. So when you get to the counter and there's no coffee in the box, you pull the new box out of the cupboard and you take this little slip out. That little slip then goes into this little pocket over on the right-hand side, which essentially tells the admin assistant to go buy a new box of coffee. This is also a Kanban system. Basically what we're doing is we're making sure that we don't have hundreds of boxes of coffee lying around, right? Because that's not good for anybody. It's going to go off. We don't have the room to store it. But we're also making sure that we don't run out. This is what we call a 2-box Kanban system, essentially making sure that we've got enough coffee to keep us going. We go and purchase it, right? We've always got enough coffee. So when we buy the new box, we put that back in the cupboard, we put the order slip in there, and again the process happens again as we move around. Now, this is a 2-box system. You could do it with 3, 4 boxes, depending on how much coffee you drink. The idea is when you get to the minimum amount of coffee that you want before you're going to run out, you essentially move this slip out. Now, the car manufacturers worked out this a long time ago. This is actually a pretty cool way to do things. And it was obviously started by the folks over at Toyota, but most of the auto manufacturers are now following it. So if you think about this at a grander scale, if you're making cars and making machinery, right, you don't want to have lots of bolts or doors or wheels hanging around the factory. So again, their pull system says that when the next step in the phase needs some parts, they'll send one of these Kanban cards down the process to tell the machine shop or whoever's waiting on that to know when to build things. And this is what a Kanban card looks like. In this case, they're making air conditioner components. Now, these are the 6 rules of Kanban. Basically, this is essentially what Toyota subscribe to if you read any of the Toyota lean type processes. And essentially what they're trying to say is you don't send defective products to the subsequent process. Now, if you think about that in software development, that's essentially saying that if you're developing something and handing it on to somebody else, you want to make sure that it's quality before you move it on. The subsequent process only withdraws what's needed. Right? So again, in software, what you don't want to do is have lots of cards trying to get to the next step that you can't do anything with. That you produce only the exact quantity needed by the next process, that you equalise production, that you fine-tune, so essentially you use retrospectives, and you stabilise and rationalise the process. 6 rules of Kanban. Now, if we think about this more from things that you're obviously more familiar with, which is software, this is actually looking at a GreenHopper wall. And the first thing you do in Kanban is you want to visualise the flow. So I said the flow moves from left to right, and it's a pull system, unlike traditionally where we push things across the wall. So instead of pushing it from to-do to development, essentially the idea is that if you're in testing, you're looking for the next thing to pull from development. So you need to visualise your flow and figure out what all your steps in the process are. And if you're using something like GreenHopper, it's extremely effective to do this because you match this up with your workflows in the back end. You can visualise it very easily. Same if you're using a manual story wall. Next step is to limit the work in progress, and this is something that's been built into the latest versions of GreenHopper. In fact, GreenHopper 5 does an even better job of this, is that you want to make sure that you have just enough work in the process, but you also want to make sure that you're not having enough as well. So in this particular case, we can see that we've got a constraint that says I can only handle a maximum of 2 cards in my testing column. I might only have 1 tester in my team, for example. So in this case, the system's saying that we've actually got too much work here, what are we going to do? In this case, if I was looking after this project, I'd probably assign some more developers or some other technical resources into the test team to help them out. We have a problem right here, right now. Secondarily, we might also want to make sure that we're making our minimums as well. So we might have a column that has a minimum constraint. Maybe it's that we don't have any less than 1 card in there. Maybe it is that we want to have 2 or more cards in the process, whatever that is. So again, you set your column constraints to make sure that you've got your minimum and your maximum set for any particular column. So in this case, we've got a maximum set for the number of issues. Now, if you're doing Agile or Scrum or even Kanban, that can be based on the number of cards. It could also be based on the number of story points. It can be based on whatever you like. But it's about essentially limiting the work in progress to make sure you're not doing too little and not doing too much, that everybody's essentially busy in the process. And this is a look at GreenHopper 5. Improved a little bit since I took this particular screenshot, but in the new version it's got a lot better. It'll actually show you red for when you're exceeding and yellow for when you're under. So in the to-do column on the left here, we were expecting 5 story points. We don't have that many. On the other side here, we've actually gone above 1 story point with 3. So again, very visual to see in your columns which one's a minimum, which one's a maximum. And it tells you at the top as well. The last part in Kanban is making sure that you measure the lead time. This is what we call a cumulative flow diagram. And essentially the idea is that you want to make sure that you're being as efficient as possible and you're actually moving through your process pretty quickly. So you can see from this diagram we can actually visualise to say where things are in to do right through to where things are in say UAT or testing. So if we use this as a guide, essentially I can see my lead time across the bottom, which might be in days, and I can see the amount of work in progress if I go up and down. It's just a very visual indicator. And the guys on the GreenHopper team tell me that this is something that's in their pipeline to work on in future. But again, you want to visualise this and you want to actually get that to the minimum possible, right? If you're seeing gaps in your process, then that's obviously a place where you want to do some fine-tuning. There's also something called Little's Law, and that's essentially what describes all this. So go take a look on Wikipedia if you want to know more about that. It's also mentioned in all the lean books as well. So when do I use Kanban, right? That's all well and good, but what does that mean to me as a software developer? Well, if you're in a maintenance or support team, iterations usually don't make a lot of sense, right? 2-week iterations, like lots of points, you're actually dealing on things on a daily basis. Things are coming in, things are going out, people are changing their priorities. Right, so if you're on maintenance support teams, this is where Kanban really comes into its own. Essentially, think of Kanban as daily iterations or daily sprints. That's the easiest way of thinking about it. That's not a rule of thumb, but if you think about that every day you come in and you reassess what your priorities are, that's essentially where Kanban comes into its own. Right? When iterations of 2 weeks or longer don't make a lot of sense. And we're having a lot of success in our organisation with doing just that on both software maintenance teams and software support teams. It could also be useful if you're a reactive team, right? So if you're actually on the outside of a software development team helping them, or perhaps you're a vendor, right? Maybe external to the organisation, or maybe you just have a long queue of work, Kanban may also be useful to you as well. So there's lots of different places where Kanban can be quite useful. Now, there's a term flying out there called Scrumban, right, which is essentially Scrum plus Kanban, and essentially gives you the best of both. The problem is that everything I spoke about there in Kanban says nothing about all the things we know and love, right? Nothing about the values and the principles that I talked about at the beginning, and nothing about things like retrospectives and stand-ups and those type of facilities that we're using to get good collaboration. So Scrumban essentially says that let's just pick the things that work for us and use them. So maybe you have half your team that does things that are reactive and half your team working on a project. Maybe you use both. So maybe you're just a support team, but you find value in doing iterations and retrospectives. I mean, if you look at Kanban, it says we should assess the flow. That is essentially a retrospective. But stand-ups are good for communication mechanisms. So using the best of both, picking the things that work out of both, putting them together. Cumulative flow diagrams are extremely useful if you're doing an Agile project and you just want to figure out why your cards aren't moving across the wall. So again, bring Kanban principles into Scrum. So think about Scrumban and using both principles together and get the best of both worlds. Now, the title of my talk was about Kaizen. Kaizen's a Japanese word, and all the cool words come from Japan, like JIRA. But Japanese is the word for improvement, and really it's about sharpening your tools, or like here from the Karate Kid, wax on, wax off, right? Really getting good at your craft. So there's a lot of Kaizen you can do even if you're a new JIRA user or perhaps if you're a seasoned JIRA user. And here's a couple of things that we've just found in our Agile space, things that just might be worth considering. So the first thing is just think about your project admin screen. So here's one of our projects. One of the things we found was that with 160 Agile projects going at any one time, we had people that had lots of different needs, lots of different workflows, lots of different things that they're doing, because we have lots of different divisions in our organisation. So we've actually set up just a number of schemes that are pre-formed that people can choose from. But out of the box, we give everybody a standard set. So we give them a standard issue type scheme, a standard notification scheme, a standard workflow scheme, which is just a basic Agile workflow scheme. But we also give them the option to change that. So if they want to get spammed instead of the low-level scheme we give them, we change them onto a spamming notification system if that's what they want. If they want a different workflow, we change them to a different workflow. But think about your project administration, right? Sometimes once you've got the thing set up, you don't go back in here too often. You can actually get a lot of power just by going back and thinking about it the way that you set up your projects and set up the administration in the back of your system. The other thing is components. Now, components traditionally are this first item here, which they were meant way back when they invented JIRA to be system components, right? It's typically things like your database, your front end, your back end. Components, however, are a first-class citizen in JIRA, and they're really powerful because your project administrators can actually manage them. Right? Depending on how your security's set up, in our case it's locked down because we don't want lots of people playing around with it, it's about the only field besides version that they can actually get in and hack without actually needing to get an administrator to help. So it's really important to make sure that people are actually getting value out of components, that they're just not using them willy-nilly for something. So, for example, on some of our teams, perhaps our support teams, we use them for systems, right? They might be looking after lots of different little systems in the organisation. Or it might be modules of a system, right? Again, they're kind of components. We've also used them for skill sets. When we've had vendors on site with us where they've had a particular skill set and we couldn't get that whole agile cross-functional team happening, actually building components around skill sets has been very powerful because it means we can use all the filtering mechanisms in GreenHopper and JIRA so that people are only seeing a story wall based on the type of work that they're doing. So, for example, we had some people that could only do front-end development for our particular application, right? We could match that skill set in there, put their cards to that component, and then give them a view of their story wall for the next iteration. They're only seeing their skill set. They're completely oblivious to what else was going on in the project, which is just the way they like it. So removing noise is very good for that. And the other thing is potentially a way to do features or epics in Agile. Right? There is an epic feature in GreenHopper, but some people like to actually have a little bit more flexibility about it. So features are also something that you can potentially use a component for. Now versions are another thing that GreenHopper kind of gives you over and above standard JIRA. And it makes a lot of sense just to think about your project setup to get the most value out of it. One of the most valuable features I've found in GreenHopper is that you can actually get hierarchical version structures when you use GreenHopper. You can do the same for components as well. That you don't get out of the box in JIRA. So what we traditionally suggest to people to do is to set up a base version with the name of your project. It's a completely redundant version, But set that up, and I'll explain why in a minute. Underneath there, you'll then set up your releases and your iterations. So you end up with this hierarchy. You also probably want to have some sort of backlog, right? So a project backlog if you want things that are a lot longer term, and a release backlog for what's in your shorter term scope. And essentially all these ones in green should add up to the amount of points that you're going to deliver in your release. The green plus the red are going to equal the amount of points or cards you're going to deliver in your release. And all the way up to the green is going to deliver you all the things that are in your project. Because all the reporting works on versions, that's why you want to have these version type structure in your setup so that you can easily report at any level. Report at an iteration level, a release level, or at a project level, especially within GreenHopper when you're using the chartboard. The other thing, if you are using GreenHopper, is to actually take a look and actually try and learn some of the features. And I know I've even sat here over the last few days and learned a couple of things that I didn't know, and I thought I knew most of the stuff that happened in the back of GreenHopper. So have a bit of a look around. The planning board is an extremely powerful place, right? Very, very useful when you're doing iteration planning, right? Not only just the drag and drop type things, but the information you can get on here, right? Setting your markers, setting the amount of story points that you're going to get through in the iteration. When you drag points in, it'll alert you when you're going to hit that limit, right? Again, the green, yellow, red bars telling you how you're doing a particular iteration. Right? Being able to prioritise your backlog, move things up and down and keep them in priority order. Extremely powerful tools. So take a look in behind the scenes and actually learn some of the good things that are in there, because there's a lot more underneath the surface than meets the eye. Similarly with the task board, right? Lots of really cool things that you can do in there, right? Particularly the way you display it. We find this kind of view is the most useful to us. It's also very easy to print if you want to get a print screen. You can usually then walk around, if you're a Scrum Master or an iteration manager, you can walk around that with that in your hand and actually have a good visualization of what's going on. But again, lots of different things underneath the covers there. So take a good look at your task board and get your staff to use it. One of the things we've found in our organisation is that we don't lock this off to our users. Once you're into JIRA, you're in to be able to do anything you like. It's essentially the same as if I invited you into our building, you walked around one of our floors, you could walk up and move a story card anywhere on a wall in the middle of the night and I wouldn't know. It's exactly the same with JIRA. Once you get the access into our system, you can move everything around. What we found was by using security for no particular reason, just added an overhead that wasn't required. So keep it simple, right? Keep it really simple and keep it exactly the same as if you're using a card wall. The other advice about this I would give you is if you're going to go down the Agile track, or perhaps if you've already been there, if you have never actually tried to put cards on a wall and move them across, this doesn't make a lot of sense, right? It's not until you've actually done it in the manual way that you really kind of get what this software is trying to do. So I strongly suggest that you might like to emulate this and actually physically move cards across a wall just to get the idea of how it all works. Then you'll actually appreciate the features that are really in the software. Again, lots of people just try to dive in and they give up because they don't quite understand what's going on. Last thing's the chartboard. Now this is what a typical iteration chart would look like. The problem with these is they tend to become very stepped, right? The idea is that we want to trend with that red line. So in this particular case, we're trying to get through, 40 odd points, right? And we need to do that within a 2-week period. The problem is that you start on the first day and you probably get no stories done. In fact, the second day you probably get none done. The third day you get none done. All of a sudden, you might sign off a bunch of cards, as in this case. So if I was to look at this chart on the second day, I'd probably be pretty panicky because I'm actually nowhere near the red line. Yet on Wednesday, bang, straight down the line comes, I'm looking pretty good. Again, it steps again. So whilst it's useful to make sure you're on track, it's actually at a level that doesn't make a lot of sense. If you're not using the hierarchies that I mentioned before, this is about the only chart view that you get. And if you're only doing iterations, it doesn't give you a lot of really valuable data. However, if you have set up those hierarchies, all that data rolls up. So in this particular case, we're looking at a release chart, and what I'm seeing is all the iterations that are in a particular release. This is a lot more valuable because it's running across a longer time frame, and I can actually see that that stepping mechanism is actually not as bad as I once thought because it's rolling down. Now in this particular case, they still got a little bit of work to do to get towards the red line, but it gives me a lot more valuable information. Similarly for a project, if I roll up to the next level, I'd actually get all the releases and all the backlogs, and I'd actually see that. So again, map out your project hierarchy really helps you when you're talking about your chartboard. And again, lots of other really useful features in here, and lots of other different charts. The trap for young players is to make sure that when you're using story points, that you've gone into the stats screen on the planning board and you've checked that you want to track stats for story points or for whatever other numerical number that you want to track on your charts. Otherwise, you won't see this kind of stuff. If you're doing time, then you'll just see that straight up. Now, JIRA and GreenHopper are not the only things that we use in our organisation. We also use Confluence, for example, right? Really gives us the ability to see our project information. We use this very much for our development teams because it's very quick and very easy. People are now quite happy to come in here and edit information and say we've got our own little theme here. We're on a reasonably old version of Confluence at the moment, but nonetheless, all the information is there for people to see. But remember, if you want to get people to use this, you've got to be what I call the wiki guy, right? When I first started introducing Confluence into the organisation, every time I'd be at a stand-up, every time I'd be at a meeting, I'd be asking someone, have you put it on the wiki? Have you put it on the wiki? Have you put it on the wiki, right? Somebody's got to take that up to actually get that culture for people to actually use it, right? This becomes most valuable when people don't think about it, if they see something wrong, if they want to change some information, whatever it is, they get on there and they update it. That's the power of Confluence, that's the power of wikis. And finally, think about how these fit into your own application lifestyle management system, your own ALM. This is the tool set that we use at Suncorp. Now, we only use a subset of the Atlassian tools, so we certainly use JIRA and GreenHopper for story cards and iteration management. We use Confluence, but we also use SharePoint for collaboration. I'd like to use Confluence all over the place, but that's not my decision. SharePoint we particularly use for our intranet and for our outwardly focusing information. So essentially, for things that are seen by our customers, they see that on SharePoint, but inwardly focusing things we want to edit all the time, we use Confluence internally. Similarly, your development environment, so there's lots of tools that you can match up in there. We use Maven, Subversion, Git and Kobatura, right? You could put Clover and other tools into there. Development tools, we have lots of different languages, so we're using things like IntelliJ, Eclipse and Visual Studio, but a lot of those integrate in with the tools as well. So, put on your tool hacking hat and see how these can actually help you out. In your testing, we're using a tool called Concordian for doing BDD type testing and WebDriver, but there's a dime a dozen tools in this testing space. This is probably one space which is still a little immature. There's lots of tools, but no real great way to do it. So if anyone wants to kind of invent something in that space, it'd be a good market. Continuous integration, we use the open source tool called Hudson. We find that quite useful. It works for all the languages that we use. Bamboo's just as good a tool, a lot easier to set up, but nonetheless. And for deployment, don't forget about deployment, how you deploy things out. Even though Bamboo and Hudson can do deployment, sometimes you need to take it to the next level. We're a financial institution, so we've got to jump through hoops to get things into our production environment. So we use a tool called Tableau to do that for us. But again, think about deployment. You want to do that at the earliest opportunity. So essentially, the first time you finish an iteration, you already want to be making production-ready code, right? Agile talks about delivering production-ready code at the end of each iteration. We don't deploy to production, but we use Tableau to make sure that we could go to production if we wanted to. So make sure your developers or yourselves are actually delivering production-ready code and production-ready deliverables at every stage of the process. So to wrap up, remember the basics, right? We talked about the 4 rules of the Agile Manifesto. We talked about the 6 rules of Kanban. I didn't talk about the 5 rules of Dodgeball, but right, those things are out there. So remember the basics, right? When I asked you at the start who's doing Agile here, lots of people will relate that to the fact that they might be doing test-driven development, stand-ups or retrospectives. Tends to be the things that most people do, or continuous integration. But it's so much more. If you haven't got those values and principles underlying, right, you're just doing some processes on top of whatever you were doing before. Real Agile development is about those underlying principles. Agile, it's gone mainstream, right? It used to be the niche type thing, right? You could actually say in the words of Fonzie, it's jumped the shark, right? So in that particular case, if you're not doing it, right, what's holding you back, right? What can you do to actually move to that phase? Because, the Fortune 500 companies, they're all on board with this, right? The number of hands we showed shows that it is actually just the mainstream right now. But if you're trying to keep up with the Joneses, perhaps you want to go to the next level, take a look into Kanban. Remember, Kanban is about visualising your flow, right, limiting the work in progress and measuring that using things like cumulative flow diagrams. Extremely useful if you're doing support and maintenance, or if 2-week iterations or time-boxed iterations don't make a lot of sense to you. And don't forget about Kaizen, right? Regardless of whether you're just starting on your JIRA and GreenHopper journey or you've been using it like us for years, there's always ways to learn and improve, right? To hone your craft. A bit like Kung Fu Panda, right? He couldn't do it when he first started, but he got really good, right? You're always learning, you're always improving, right? We talk about retrospectives, Kanban talks about improving. That's essentially what the essence of Agile is all about. It's about learning and improving, right? And it's also about delivering business value, and it's about having a lot of fun along the way. And finally, take a look in your toolbox, right? Sometimes we just use a lot of tools just because they're cool, just because they add a lot of value, right? Think about what's actually in your toolbox and is it giving you value. If it's not, go back to something more simple. That may then open up to say, what tool do I want to use? So again, if you're thinking about Agile Storywalls, once you've done cards on a wall, right, you then might think that moving to a tool like GreenHopper is really good. It may not be completely obvious if you haven't gone that way. And similarly, look at all the old tools you've got in your toolbox. Are they adding value? Is there something better out there? Or can you improve the way that you're working with them? So that's it. I hope that was of some value to you. Open to any questions if anyone's got them. Yep.
On the slide where you showed how you set up your projects and your releases, I was kind of curious, are those all separate projects, or how was the hierarchy defined?
So we've actually found you can do it two ways. We have in the project, and when you see the slide deck, you'll see a bit more detail. Sometimes we have multiple projects inside one project if there's a need to be able to share information. So, for example, we're doing quite a large project at the moment where we have two sub-main projects. They're actually quite large, but there's a third integration project that actually weaves the two together. And we found usefulness out of actually setting a hierarchy, actually putting another level on the top there that actually let all three of those projects sit in the one JIRA project to actually see them. In a lot of other cases, we just have a project which has got that hierarchy. Sometimes you don't need releases, so you don't put it in. In the case of the big project, sometimes you might need another level. Sometimes we actually have versions that aren't even those type of things. Like, for example, we did a very big project with a vendor. We actually had a whole version bucket that just had all the issues that were with that vendor, right? So, again, it was very easy to see when they were with a vendor as opposed to using custom fields or something like that.
So, just now when you talk about Kanban, you say it's pull instead of push.
Mm-hmm.
So normally, the way we do it is devs fix their bugs and then send it to a waiting QA. Can you describe how does that work? Does QA just grab tickets from the devs? How would they know whether it's done or not?
Yeah, so the idea is that your definition of done is that everybody's working as a collective team to move something across the board. So traditionally the old way is a dev does something, throws it across a wall, and a tester picks it up. That's the old push mechanism. In the pull mechanism, essentially what we're saying is bring the collective team together, right? Even though we have experts in QA and experts in development, the entire team's responsible for getting it across the line. So the QA is essentially saying to the developers, I need more work, or, whoa, hold up, I've got too much work, how about you come over and give me a hand? Right, and you can similarly move that same story down the line. It might be that the analysts are having trouble getting the stories across the line, so maybe the devs will go and help them out, or so move that across however you like. Right. The thing with Kanban is to make sure that you set up those swim lanes or those process lanes with all the things that make sense for you to visualize that moving through. Right, because you want to be able to see where your bottlenecks are.
Any other questions?
You mentioned early on about having lots and lots of projects and clearing them out. So what does that mean when you say you're clearing out projects from your portfolio?
Yeah, so firstly, we don't use JIRA for our main help desk type functionality. We actually use some other big commercial vendor product for that. We typically use JIRA for our projects and the bugs associated with those. So one of the things we found was that, a bit like story cards on a wall, right? Index cards like this aren't very valuable to you, 2 years after the project. In fact, if you've got lots of data on these, it's not the right place to put them. So firstly, we put all our real project artifacts in Confluence, right? So we put all the information that needs to be kept after time leave that in a place where it's actually more accessible and easier to search and find all those type of things. And JIRA really just has the bits and pieces of information that we actually did to get there to actually do the card. So after you finished a project, for the most part, all this stuff that's in JIRA is pretty useless, right? Because the artifact I've actually got is the working software, the feature's been delivered. Very rare I have to go back to that. So in order to just keep our the size of our system down, to keep it maintainable, we go through periodically, probably every 6 to 12 months, and we actually clear out all the redundant projects. Right? We take a backup of that data, but the likelihood of anybody needing it is very rare. So we have a few projects that stick around, right? And especially our support teams. Our support teams obviously stay there, but we do lots of very small projects, lots of large projects. Once the project's been delivered, that data is pretty much redundant. So you have to kind of ask yourself, if you're going back into JIRA lots for project type information to get valuable stuff out of there, maybe it's being stored in the wrong place.
All right, thanks, Greg.
Thank you.